So I am here to talk to you. I'm curious, so it's hard for me to see. Raise your hand if you know what happened in California like a few days ago. It's about a third and a half. Cool, that's about what I thought it would be. So for some of you, this will be quite new. For some of you, you've seen it in the news. And I find that in and of itself very interesting because you would not think that 2.5 million people in the United States losing power for an indefinite period of time would not dominate the national news cycle. And yet, it didn't. We're taking this for granted now. Interesting times. So a lot of the problems in California with wildfires, a lot of the time when you mention, okay, wildfires in California are becoming more severe, more intense, more frequent, people will say, oh, it's probably climate change. And they're not totally wrong. Climate change is definitely a big part of why fire is becoming an increasingly dominant part of California's socioeconomic and sociopolitical landscape. So as you can see, even without climate change, wildfires would be increasing in the state of California. But with climate change, it's much, much, much worse. So biophysical factors are 100% playing a role in this. But I'm much more interested in the policy because it's not just climate change. Climate change obviously is, to a certain extent, a social choice, but it's kind of an indirect social choice. The way that wildfires in California are causing new and special kinds of havoc is the product of policy as much as it's a product of climate change or any other physical factor. In particular, California's housing crisis. So, as of speaking right now, approximately half of California's residents live in an area with high wildfire risk. It's the most intense wildfire risk of anywhere in the country. Half of the state's citizens. That's an astounding number. It hasn't always been this way. So the intersection of wildfire risk and human hazard is no accident. It comes as a result of extreme need for housing, vested interests within California refusing to let people build dense housing in urban centers, and extremely pro-development, pro-sprawl policies, enabling cities, instead of growing up, to grow out. And the farther cities grow out, the closer they get to where the wildfires are. It's called the wildland-urban interface, and it is a central feature of California's ecology now. Why is this happening? As you can see, we've got some major biophysical things happening. We've got climate change. We've also got the fact that a lot of California is what's considered a fire ecology region. Fire is a native part of parts of California's ecology. There are plant species in California that have evolved so that the only way their seeds germinate is after a fire. Fire is a part of the Californian landscape and always has been. It's only with our recent policy of fire suppression that wildlands in California have not been characteristically scarred by fire anymore. Climate change, obviously, making this worse. But all of these other factors, these are social choices. These are policy. So poor disaster planning, the fact that we as a country are simply not prepared for disasters. We plan for the last disaster instead of the next one. That's a huge problem. fire suppression. The fact that instead of allowing small fires to burn, which is both good ecologically and good strategically because it burns off the fuel and makes later fires less severe, we don't do that anymore. We've got Smokey the Bear telling us it's bad. We also have hundreds of years of ecological knowledge telling us that it's necessary to keep forests healthy. Who do we believe? The bear. We've also got lack of investment in infrastructure, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Because lack of investment in infrastructure is one of the climate change problems that you've probably never thought about, but is going to characterize your future. And finally, we have pro-sprawl housing policy. It's not just a problem in the Midwest. And as cities get bigger and bigger and bigger, they get closer and closer to hazards. Hazards like floodplains, hazards like landslide risk, and hazards like fires. We tend to think of fires as a physical issue. They're a policy problem. So to put this into context, in case you've probably heard of the Camp Fire, you may not know about the details. The Camp Fire is the most significant fire that's ever happened in California's history. It happened last year. And this is the town of Paradise. So I used to know people who lived in Paradise. Fortunately, they don't live there anymore and didn't live there last year, because if they had, their house would be gone, because the entire town of Paradise burned down. At least 85 people died. This is almost certainly an underestimate. 52,000 people were evacuated. Almost all of them were funneled onto one of two main roads out of town. You can't put 52,000 people on two roads. It doesn't work. The fire went faster than the cars. A lot of the people who died in their cars trying to get out of town. And what set off the fire was not arson or lightning. It was crappy electricity infrastructure. This is the setting for the public safety power shutoff, which happened from October 9th to 12th. The electricity infrastructure that started the Camp Fire is owned by Pacific Gas and Electric, which is the state's largest investor-owned electric utility, the state's largest electric utility. The fact that it's investor-owned is important. It is not a fully public utility, it is not a nonprofit. It exists to make profits for its shareholders. PG&E is now bankrupt because it's responsible for all the fires it keeps setting off, including but not limited to the entire town of Paradise. And so the California state legislature passed a law that there can be a public safety power shutoff, which is a predetermined time to shut off the power if you think there are going to be wildfires. It is legal for utilities to do this. They're supposed to give 48 hours notice. And because of the way electricity infrastructure works, they don't actually know when the power is going to come back on again. It's like it's a real roller coaster. So the most recent and first major public safety power shutoff involved turning off the power to 738,000 customers, which is estimated to be 2.5 million people. At least 130,000 school children couldn't go to school. And that's not even counting the universities. So my own grad school, nobody went to school for 3 days, which was, exciting, but got real boring real fast. So the net costs of the public safety power shutoff are estimated at anywhere from about 1.8 at the low end to $2.6 billion at the high end. But these are indirect costs. Pacific Gas and Electric is not responsible for paying this bill. And this is why it's so easy for them to turn the power off instead of investing in their own infrastructure. But this policy is not without cost. There's the literal economic cost. There are also the people who died because the power got shut off. Because if you're dependent on electricity for medical devices, you're going to die when the power goes out if you don't have a safe place to go. And at least one person died during the PSPS. Again, this is probably an underestimate. I know people who were frantically searching for places to go because they knew the power was going to be shut off and they were really worried about dying. This is aside from all of the food that rotted in refrigerators, all of the car crashes because there were no stoplights, all of the businesses that lost money. There's a human cost to this. And, of course, it went really well. No, it didn't. It was terrible. It was awful. They were totally not ready to do this at all. It will probably go down in history as a public policy disaster. I can't wait to write a paper about it. It's going to be really exciting. So let's start with some of the highlights, shall we? So officially, they were supposed to give 48 hours notice. Some communities didn't get warned at all. PG&E admitted that their alert infrastructure didn't work. Information about which specific areas where the power would be turned out was only available, if it was available, a few hours beforehand. But guess what? You couldn't get to the information because the website crashed for the entire time. So even if you had power, even if you had internet, even if you were trying to prepare for the power shutoff you knew was coming, you couldn't get to that information. There was a little bit on Google, but it was out of date. I know, because I was trying to figure out if my relatives were going to lose power because they didn't know. That's the situation that California, the most economically powerful state in the nation, was in for 4 days. This is Silicon Valley. This is the most expensive cities in the country. The amount of wealth that is deposited in these places where the electricity is turned off is astounding. And it didn't even make the national news. Again, we live in interesting times. So there were no alternative alert systems in place to accommodate the lack of electricity. And so, although the power had been turned off to prevent fires, there were still fires. And nobody knew. They happened in the middle of the night. People were evacuated, luckily. It is genuinely only luck that people in Moraga were evacuated. Other people did die in Southern California in a fire that wasn't related to the PSPS, but could easily have been. So turning off the electricity does not prevent fires, but it does prevent people from getting emergency alerts. This is bad. This is just crappy planning. There's a wonderful New York Times article that I encourage you to read about how bad this was. As the chairman of the State Senate Subcommittee on Energy, Utilities, and Communications put it, today marks an unprecedented turn in the history of electricity in California. This situation is not acceptable nor sustainable. And yet, again, didn't even make the national news. Infrastructure is not sexy. But if all the lights went out in this auditorium, if all the lights went out in Naperville, and you didn't know when they were coming on again, that would affect your life. Infrastructure, that magnificent, unsexy topic, is what keeps our lives running. And without it, we do not have civilization as we know it. And yet, PG&E responsible for providing a significant portion of California's electricity infrastructure is, I believe the technical term is shit show. So PG&E, again, an investor-owned utility. They raised $4.5 million from ratepayers. They raised everybody's electricity rates. They said they were going to use it to improve the infrastructure so there would be fewer wildfires. Instead, they gave all of that money as shareholder dividends. And the California Public Utility Commission let them do it. They're supposed to regulate PG&E. I don't know why they don't. A lot of people speculate it's because PG&E is particularly generous with the campaign contributions. I think it's just laziness. I think it's because people don't care about infrastructure. But guess what? You need to. We can't take infrastructure for granted anymore. The PSPS is a sign of things to come. Every year, California faces a worse fire season. This is a map not of fires, but of the air quality. Because it's not just your town burning down, it's also everybody not being able to breathe. So my friends in the Bay Area, I know more about air quality masks than I ever wanted to know, because all of my friends in the Bay Area were posting about it on Facebook when the fires were happening, because nobody could breathe. We think about air pollution from the butts of cars. This is air pollution from fires, and this is going to get worse and worse and worse. So there are all of these consequential effects that come from the fires, that come from these natural policy failures, that extend into public policy failures. PG&E is in the hands of a bankruptcy judge, and nobody knows what's going to happen. They estimate it will take 10 years to modernize their infrastructure. Nobody knows if it's ever going to happen. Unless the CPUC actually makes them do it, it probably won't. So what can California do? California can, to begin with, take an active role in climate change adaptation. That's my specialty, that's my wheelhouse, that's my jam. But we need to accept that this is the new normal. Fire season ain't never getting better. It's only getting worse, and we need to live with that. But there are lots of other things we can do. For example, stop building in the wildland-urban interface, for heaven's sake. Stop with these sprawling policies. Sprawl is bad for carbon emissions, it's bad for human health, and it's really bad for fire. Also, enforce the fire safety laws. California doesn't do that either. That's bad. Permit active fire management, including controlled burns. Make controlled burns sexy again. I don't know how they're going to do it, but they need to. They need to regulate the hell out of PG&E and other utilities. But that's not for California alone. That's for us too. Because as we're talking about stuff like decentralizing the electricity grid, we need to be thinking about the Midwest. California is not an isolated example. California is a lesson we can learn from. It's a harbinger of things to come. Climate change threatens infrastructure all over the United States. And unless we take an interest in it, we're not going to regulate it properly, and we're not going to protect ourselves. We've got heat waves, we've got floods, we've got severe storms on the way. All of this is going to eventually turn off the power here. What are we going to do about it? That's the policy question that you all will be facing in your future. And step one is caring about infrastructure. I don't know how to make it cool or fun. I don't know how to make it the kind of thing that you talk about, like I don't know, maybe a Kardashian could like get infrastructure like tattooed right here. I would be fine with that. I would pay for it. But I don't care how it happens. What I care about is that our attention changes and that infrastructure becomes something that we talk about, that we care about, and we stop taking civilization for granted. Thank you.